According to the National Electrical Code, specific conditions must be met to create a legal tap in electrical wiring. A tap is a connection where a smaller conductor is connected to a larger conductor. The scenario presents a situation where a 12-gauge wire is used for the main circuit with a 20-amp overcurrent protection device, and then a 14-gauge wire is used for the switch leg and the wiring between recessed can lights. This arrangement does not constitute a legal tap based on the NEC guidelines. The NEC sets forth several rules that must be followed for tap conductors. Firstly, the tap conductor must have an ampacity sufficient for the loads served by the tap. This means the wire size must be adequate to handle the current drawn by the devices it feeds. Secondly, the tap conductor must be protected from overcurrent by the overcurrent protection device protecting the larger conductor it's tapped from, or by a separate overcurrent protection device at the tap. Thirdly, the tap conductor must not extend beyond certain lengths. These lengths vary depending on the application and the ampacity of the tap conductor relative to the overcurrent protection device protecting the larger conductor. In the scenario described, the 14-gauge wire is being used as a tap off of the 12-gauge wire. The NEC typically requires the tap conductor to be of the same gauge as the larger conductor from which it is tapped. Although the NEC does provide exceptions, such as the 10-foot tap rule and the 25-foot tap rule, these exceptions have specific requirements. One of the most common tap rules is the 10-foot tap rule. According to this rule, the tap conductor can be smaller than the main conductor if it meets all of the following conditions. 1. The tap conductor has an ampacity of not less than 1/3 of the overcurrent protection device protecting the circuit conductors. 2. The tap conductor terminates in a single circuit breaker or a fuse rated no more than the ampacity of the tap conductor, or the tap conductor feeds a transformer. And 3. The tap conductor is not longer than 10 feet and is installed in a raceway. Another tap rule is the 25-foot tap rule. This rule says that the tap conductor can be smaller than the main conductor if it meets all of the following conditions. 1. The tap conductor has an ampacity of not less than 1/3 of the overcurrent protection device protecting the circuit conductors. 2. The tap conductor terminates in a single circuit breaker or a fuse rated no more than the ampacity of the tap conductor, or the tap conductor feeds a transformer. And 3. The tap conductor is not longer than 25 feet and is protected from physical damage and is installed in a raceway. In the specific case presented, using 14-gauge wire on a 20-amp circuit with 12-gauge wire is not a legal tap. According to NEC Table 310.16, 14-gauge copper wire has an ampacity of 15 amps at 60 degrees Celsius, 20 amps at 75 degrees Celsius, and 25 amps at 90 degrees Celsius. Note that these values are for copper conductors. If aluminum conductors are used, the ampacity values are different. 12-gauge copper wire has an ampacity of 20 amps at 60 degrees Celsius, 25 amps at 75 degrees Celsius, and 30 amps at 90 degrees Celsius. The temperature rating of the wire and the terminals on the devices it is connected to must be considered. Generally, the 60 degrees Celsius column is used for circuits rated 100 amps or less, using terminals rated for 60 degrees Celsius. Using a 20-amp overcurrent protection device means the 14-gauge wire must be protected at 15 amps according to NEC 240.4d. This section of the code states that unless specifically permitted in 240.4e or 240.4g, overcurrent protection shall be in accordance with 240.4b and 240.4c. The standard overcurrent device to protect 14-gauge wire is 15 amps. If the 14-gauge wire were used as a tap, it would need to be protected at its ampacity, typically 15 amps, unless an exception applies. Using a 20-amp breaker on a 14-gauge wire section violates this rule. The use of arc fault circuit interrupters, or of size, does not change these requirements for conductor sizing and overcurrent protection. An FSI is a type of breaker designed to protect against arc faults, which are dangerous electrical conditions that can cause fires. While FSIs provide an additional layer of safety, they do not allow for undersized wiring. The NEC also has specific requirements for the installation of recessed lighting fixtures, often referred to as can lights. These requirements include ensuring adequate clearance between the fixture and combustible materials, using the correct type of wiring, and properly grounding the fixture. The wiring between recessed lights must also comply with the NEC rules for tap conductors. In summary, the described scenario of using 14-gauge wire for a switch like and between CAN lights on a 20-amp circuit with 12-gauge wire is not a legal tap according to the NEC. The 14-gauge wire is not protected at its appropriate ampacity, and it does not meet the requirements for any of the NEC tap rules. To correct this situation, there are several options. Firstly, the 14-gauge wire could be replaced with 12-gauge wire throughout the circuit. This would ensure that the entire circuit is protected by the 20-amp breaker. Secondly, a 15-amp breaker could be installed to protect the 14-gauge wire. This would require separating the 14-gauge wire from the 12-gauge wire at a junction box and running a separate circuit. Thirdly, if the tap conductors meet all requirements of NEC 240.21c, such as the 10-foot or 25-foot tap rules, it could be a legal tap. It is important to always consult the latest edition of the NEC and to consult with a qualified electrician to ensure that all electrical work is performed safely and in compliance with the code.